Chapter 24. You have completed a legacy quest. Find Drawson Welling. You found Drawson Welling. Reward 1,500 XP. The master's words came unexpectedly low, unsure.
Your father was Tereshan of Surin, right?
My father's final words echoed in my mind.
If I fall, find Drawson Welling. He will see to your training.
My father was Terry the farmer up until the last moments I knew him. Drawson nodded solemnly.
Yes, I heard of your ill tidings on campus. You have my deepest condolences.
His gaze rose past me.
Come, Roshan awaits us, and we have much to discuss.
Roshan? Is she the one who told you about my father's passing? Welling gave a single curt nod. His eyes drifted to the cobblestones underfoot.
Sad tidings indeed.
And how did you know my father?
Not here. Come.
Where are we going? To the temple?
No. Roshan manages a gem shop on the outer row, just down from the chapel.
Since Luli had mentioned the place, his words carried legitimacy, but I probed just to be sure. Why would a light priestess own a gem shop? Crow's feet deepened at the corners of his eyes, and his lips curved.
Why not? Is a priestess not allowed to engage in commerce?
He waved me toward him, then pivoted and paced up the closest alley leading west without even looking back to see if I followed. I gazed down the road to find Luli and Benson moving in our direction. I threw up a hand to wave them off. They returned the gesture and turned back. Enslaved by curiosity and my father's last wish, I followed Drawson Welling.
Roshan uses the profits to fund the chapel and to contribute to the academy. As you might imagine, recruiting students of all ilk to learn magic and crafting skills isn't without its costs.
And a gem shop on the edge of town contributes significantly? Welling shook his head.
There is not a salaried master on staff. The former university worked on a stipend from the king's coffers in exchange for the registration of magic users. It's fortunate they were somewhat frugal with the funds and left a surplus, but other interested parties contribute.
When he turned right at the end of the dark alley and we stepped into the moonlight, I breathed a sigh of relief. The night was chilly, and the brisk wind funneled the wind between buildings made the temperature feel even colder. But without the constraints of the alley creating the cross breeze, this road was more comfortable. The warmth I'd encountered when Welling appeared bloomed as I jogged forward a few steps to walk beside him. Who contributes? Why?
Just here, on the right.
I didn't know where else the shop would be, considering only a low wall sat on our left, but I noticed no entrance where he indicated either. He reached for a recessed door I would have missed if I'd passed it in broad daylight, knocked 4 times, then once more. The lock clicked, then the door swung open to reveal Roshan, her long black locks resting loosely upon her shoulders. She wore a simple but finely spun white pullover and black trousers. Without a word, she waved us in. Beyond a short mudroom, we passed through a kitchen area and into the dark shop. I assumed it was closed for the night, like all the other businesses. Most shuttered their windows an hour after sundown. The people of Warrington rose early, something we had in common until I arrived at the academy and events brought a constant exhaustion. "I shall never grow used to the prickles you compel," Roshan muttered, but with a slight smile. The priestess must have been referencing his shadow affinity. It made sense, as I'd responded to him in the same way. While I contemplated this, I realized he was staring at me as he leaned against a counter between high chairs. When I looked away, I found Roshan's gaze also locked on me. She studied me, then one side of her mouth curved upward in sync with the eyebrow on the opposite side. "Why do you seem surprised, Tess? Did you think I was talking to Master Welling?" I glared. Roshan smiled. "Of course you did. Why wouldn't you? But you should know when your fellow students in the light school level up and bind themselves to the light, they will be in a constant state of chill around you until they mature." "Wonderful," I scowled. "You have much to learn about magic. I wonder if your father raised the subject of your mana pool at all." The tone she used when discussing my father pinged my nerves like a mallet on lute strings. Although it might have been prudent to measure my tone considering our latest interaction, my mouth was strides ahead of my mind on the topic. "And what would you know of him?" Drawson Welling replied.
She might know little, Contessa of Milbury, but I know what desires he held for you.
"How would you know that? How were you even acquainted?" His gaze flitted toward Roshan, then back.
The tale might be a tad long if you wish to sleep tonight.
He smiled, but I didn't match it. His shoulders dropped a bit. Roshan walked toward the kitchen. I will make tea. Would you have some, Tess? I shook my head. Drawson nodded when she cast him a questioning glance. The priestess set off for the kitchen. When she was gone, I folded my arms across my chest.
His spirit is strong in you. Come.
Drawson patted a high chair seat, but renewed belligerence stiffened my legs, and I shook my head. He sat, then spun the top of the chair to face me.
Let me spin my tale, and your questions will be answered.
How will you answer my questions if you don't know what they are?
You provided the first two.
Did I?
You asked how I was acquainted with your father, and how I'd know what he wanted for you. Would that suffice for a starting point?
Since the questions had been less than a minute past my lips, and because I recalled the half-frenzied state in which I'd asked them, I felt like a real idiot. I needed to sharpen up. As this was shaping up to be a long discussion, and as I was already tired, I pried my feet from the floor, then slid into a chair. Yes, it would suffice. How did you know my father?
How I knew your parents is a story for another time.
My head jerked so hard I thought my spine might snap. Parents? You knew my mother too?
I hope you were being sincere about your willingness to lose sleep.
I was.
I know your mother, Tess.
A lump formed in my throat. He looked away, perhaps uncomfortable with my show of emotion.
What story did your father tell you?
That she died in childbirth, of course.
I see.
The hint of a frown creased the corners of his mouth, and in that simple motion, he sent a shockwave up and down my body that made my flesh tingle. Wait, so my mother did not die when she birthed me?
Your parents met when people across Rubal were being registered, provided they were lucky enough to avoid outright subjugation. The king mandated magic users be kept under a watchful eye. If they refused and hid their gifts, they were imprisoned.
My father kept so much from me. A knot formed in my belly with the realization of just how true the words were. Master Welling nodded.
That first moment after your binding broke must have been disorienting. Most children and young adults receive forewarning. Where were you when it happened?
Fleeing demons, I waved an impatient hand. You frowned in such a way that...
I'm coming to it. Be patient, Tess.
He leaned forward.
Trust me. It's an attribute you must expand if you're to survive in this world.
The stony gaze sealed my lips.
Since your mother wanted to avoid the watchful eyes of the monarch and his bastard regent, the governor of Nal, she moved constantly after her mother died. She never knew her father, so she understood what you'd be going through.
She knew? I almost slid off my chair to protest the roundabout way he was getting to business, but he pressed a hand to my knee and I stopped.
She took up adventuring and used her magic to fight back demonkind. Since so few adventurers remained in light of the king's laws surrounding magicians, the occupation had become uncommon. Eventually she found your father, who'd formed a party of non-magic users. The way she tells it, they spent much of the proceeds from their battles on potions. But when your mother joined their party, they set out in search of a bona fide healer. They eventually found one in a temple up north, but that's a story for another day. After years of adventuring, your parents fell in love. Then your mother got pregnant with you. They decided to take the winnings of their adventuring life and build in the Northern Territory, where the governor's men didn't patrol and the monarch hadn't sent delegations in decades. When your father went for supplies one day, your mother left their cabin and encountered 2 grizzlies.
Bears? My jaw dropped. He nodded.
Towering monsters. You see, your mother used an anti-magic shield spell to hide her magic capabilities. Her mana pool would be invisible to anyone who analyzed her. She only cast when the party was underground because there were beings out there who could find people based on their spell casting. They could find anyone, really, but spellcasters called out to them when they dared unleash their abilities above ground.
I pictured the tome with notes in the margins, the study beneath the academy. You're talking about the scryer. Again, Welling nodded. Roshan returned with a tray holding 3 cups. She set it on the counter where a glass top covered multicolored gems. They glowed when she approached. I brought you some anyway. Chamomile soothes the soul, and yours might need soothing. Welling continued.
The Warsager was a dark being who employed many scryers in those days. They spread out across the continent, seeking out those who escaped the king's justice. Or, at least, that's the story. In truth, there were more nefarious uses of magic users, which I won't discuss tonight. When your mother came under attack with you resting in her belly, she reacted in the only way she knew how, and laid the grizzlies to rest.
I blew a breath through a gaping mouth. To imagine my own mother wielded power, and that my father hid it from me all my life. Then his meaning dawned. And one of the scryers found her.
Yes. They silenced her and brought her to the academy.
Which is where the Warsager resided under everyone's noses, Roshan said. Fools couldn't see the evil right beneath them, except for the complicit. Welling nodded agreement.
And the complicit were powerful. But that's yet another story for the future.
Welling leaned back, then crossed his legs.
By the time my group learned your mother had been taken into custody with child, she'd been moved to the governor's palace.
My mother was in Milbury Peaks, then?
In the bowels of the palace. In a cell.
To what end?
We knew through our connections that the king's subjects with barren wives would pay a pile of coin for any child, but a manor-bearing one. The child would be a symbol of their high status, a sick reflection of their own connections to the Latrell monarchy. That they'd be allowed to register and keep them made them appear special.
My nose twitched. Rubal is a much sicker place than I believed growing up.
Suffice it to say, my people opposed the weight of the monarch's golden hand pressed on the necks of people like us. We put together a team, infiltrated the palace, and rescued her.
He shook his head and spoke in a lower tone.
A bloodier ordeal than we'd anticipated, I'm afraid.
One shoulder jumped, then fell. His tone returned to normal.
Now that the scryers knew of her, she would never be safe. Unlike before, when she'd stayed on the move in the interest of safety, she was a known fugitive. She feared she'd have to flee on a boat to another continent to escape the king's grasp, but we offered her an alternative.
Who are we? I asked. Who are your people?
We're the descendants of magic users who stood against the king when he handed down the proclamation that all magic users would be registered or imprisoned. When the atrocities I mentioned earlier came into play in a dark communion with the underworld, my grandmother and the rest of her group rose up in bloody rebellion. But they were greatly outnumbered by the king's forces, many of whom were magicians, subjugated or born into his allies' families. They spread to different continents, formed small covens, and used their magic to conceal themselves. I was born into it, and benefited by learning the magics of a coven in northern Rubal. Then I became an infiltrator. Like my mother before me, I ventured from town to town in eastern Rubal, making connections with sympathizers, building a network so that one day, when the goddess saw fit to open a door for our return, we would be prepared.
No more being outnumbered? I asked.
How astute of you, Tess.
And now you're here, at the academy. Why?
Isn't it obvious? If we want to stand against the king, remove him from his very throne and end the Latrell line forever, we will need the best of the best to stand with us.
Although weighty on their own, the words suffered in comparison to the realization they brought flooding like icy water through my veins. You're training an army. You're going to start a civil war.
To hear your bluntness, I'd think I was talking to your mother.
Although I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer, I had to ask the question that lay beneath all this subtext. Where is my mother?
I'm afraid I don't know.
An anticlimactic response? I didn't bother suppressing my frown. He gave a deep, slow nod until his chin pressed to his chest.
And I'm sorry for that, but your mother will find me when the time comes. Until then, she dictates her own missions for the coven.
You mentioned its name in the alley. What was it? He nodded.
We call ourselves the Shadow Coven.
Ominous. My lip crooked with sarcasm. Contessa, Roshan uttered in low tones. Master Welling chuckled, then waved her off.
It's okay, priestess. I'm not so easily offended.
No idea where I can find her?
Why, would you run off tomorrow?
Welling asked.
Trudge across the continent to the east, 4,000 miles over land and lake?
I grunted. Maybe. A thought occurred. How long are you willing to wait?
What do you mean?
There's no way the students of this academy, combined with the one I keep hearing about for warriors and the like up north, number enough for war.
Again, astute of you. Our matron has seen fit to provide us with assistance on this front.
Who is your matron?
Queen Semonsia.
The Elven Queen? Welling smiled.
Indeed.
Where does she come into this?
For one thing, she helps to fund the work we do at the Academy. Like I said, the shop in which you sit turns most of its profits to the purpose as well. I'm sure this would be a great surprise to the man who owned it before.
What man? He waved me off, but when I pinched my lips together, he rolled his eyes and answered.
A magician named Prontu, who used to be second in command at the university. He was my contact here in my business for the council. He reached out when things took a turn for the better in Eastern Rubal, and told us about
Roshan stopped him with a subtle shake of her head. More secrets. Because I knew she'd lived there once, something told me this one had something to do with the master of the foundation everyone refused to talk about.
Prontu died before the governor was dethroned, but when we received word from him of certain events I'm obligated to keep in my lungs, I came. Roshan knew Prince Tryon Ranard, so we parleyed with the Queen and another special being.
His gaze flicked to Roshan. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get to the bottom of things.
We decided to form the Academy. The Queen helped fund it. And to finally answer your query about the population required to form an army, she has elves scouring the east for magic users to offer them refuge and training here. Then they can decide whether they'd fight for their freedom.
And they can leave when they like? He nodded.
Have no doubts about that, Tess. We are not what came before, but the people of Eastern Rubal share feelings ranging from mistrust to utter fear of the Latrell line and how they've managed the continent for generations. They're ready for this. They just need to be convinced to join the cause, then taught how to survive it.
And why would they trust the elves? This time, the master laughed outright.
Because they're the by-goddess elves. Everyone loves the elves except for demons and the shade elves.
He leaned forward.
And when's the last time you saw a shade elf in Eastern Rubal?
Why are you telling me all this? You can't possibly be so open about it in public. Why trust me?
I have my reasons. That's all I can say for now.
Roshan shook her head again. Tell her the rest. She raked her gaze over me. Tell her how she is not so slick as she thinks. Explain to her how a level 38 priestess of the light can detect her shadow aura at farthest sight of her. Astute? She pushed off the counter and folded her arms beneath her bosom. When Welling didn't start, she cocked her chin at him. Well? No? Fine. She gave the counter a light slap, then rested both hands on it. The gems beneath glowed brighter. We're not telling you because we trust you, Tess. After all, why would we trust someone who whisked away dark treasures that didn't belong to her? She who won't even show herself to us. Show myself? She snapped her fingers twice. Come on, Tess, wake up. In that moment, she reminded me of Luli an hour earlier. You mean the shadow you detect in me? Roshan nodded as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. I wasn't sure this more abrupt version of her way was my favorite. Fine. What do you want to know? Besides the location of the tomes you uncovered, I'd like to know what your affinity for shadow magic is. The muscle above my lips twitched. I dare you to sneer at me, Contessa. She leaned further over the counter. Don't mistake my chosen occupation for weakness, girl. This night you will satisfy me or be driven from this place. Welling raised one hand.
Roshan.
They shared an intense look. Then she crossed her arms again and stood with her back straight as a rod. Despite their fullness, her lips formed a white line as her gaze traveled the dark room. The gems in the case dimmed. Are you willing to tell me the number? My focus shifted from Roshan to the Shadow Master, then back. The priestess didn't meet my gaze, but for reasons unknown to me, I addressed her. Will I be forced into the Shadow School? She finally met my gaze. Her features softened, but it wasn't me she spoke to. She's never seen the world. Destiny found her in the snow almost dead. Before that, she could probably count the number of people she's known on the fingers of both hands.
Fewer, actually.
Roshan nodded understanding. Tess, do you think you're the only student who hides her stronger affinity from us? I hope you'll understand I worry about your affinity because I have a friend like you. I understand the ramifications. What worries you? Welling chimed in.
The susceptibility to darkness cursed upon the shadow-powered. Those unbalanced shadowcasters who paid no attention to the light have been influenced by demonkind in ways unimaginable to those unfamiliar with the stories.
A cold wave washed over me despite Welling's close proximity, like my blood ran hot while gooseflesh pricked up on my arms. Welling didn't give me time to think.
So, are you going to tell us?
What's yours? I asked, delaying. More games, Roshan said, even if a bit more gently. Welling waved her off.
No, it's fine. My shadow affinity is 80%.
I cocked an eyebrow and double-checked my affinities. Magic affinities. Potential, 100%. Light, 25%. Shadow, 91%. Why was I so afraid of those numbers? If they wouldn't force me to change schools, why didn't I want to share them?
Trust no one.
My mind answered. You lied to me all your life. It's you I shouldn't have trusted. I blurted the answer. 91%. Welling slipped off his stool. Roshan took a lumbering step backward and clapped a hand of splayed fingers to her chest. What? Master Welling pinched his chin with his thumb and forefinger while supporting it at the elbow with his other hand.
Potential?
I lowered my voice to a whisper. 100?
100.
Welling belched. He reached for the chair beside him and stumbled into it. Magister Lyra had kept her promise not to share my potential. Roshan leaned her arms on the counter and hid her face. Oh, my sweet goddess, what gift have you sent to us this day? She chuckled. Welling joined in. Then the laughter bloomed until the two of them couldn't stop. Their faces reddened. Somehow, I didn't feel the humor. It was my turn to fold my arms across my chest. It's funny? Welling soon calmed, to my relief. When he was able to form words again, he leaned in and set a hand on my shoulder.
My girl, you have the highest known shadow affinity at Warrington Academy, and your potential couldn't be higher.
Roshan circled the counter and threw both arms around me. Then she kissed the side of my head. Oh, you poor thing. You didn't want to leave Shabana, so you hid your true self. And despite the earlier berating, her sudden understanding of my reason for choosing the light school of magic flooded me with warm respite from the fear of moments ago, and I knew I loved her.